who are also on the phone. If you would acknowledge yourself, the committee members, please.
Clyburn, Delphine Clyburn, Ward 20.
Thank you.
Alder Evelyn Rodriguez, Ward 4.
Alder Saban,
Alder Eli Saban, Ward 1.
thank you.
Alder Hurt, Ward 3.
Okay, thank you. And we do have a quorum. I do want to say that we have a couple of Board of Alders members who have joined us and not on the committee. Alder Roth, Alder Gerald Cantu, and if I miss anybody, the Richard Furlow. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. And what I'd like to do is have Ms. Mears, if she's available, to come on to talk about the police commissioners. Is Alder Mears, is Ms. Mears available?
Yes, here I am.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm not used to the Zoom webinar format. I'm used to the regular Zoom, so I wasn't exactly sure how to get in. Also, I didn't hear the last thing you said. You said my name and then I didn't hear anything.
Oh, I just said, is she available? That's all I said.
Yes, I'm available.
Okay.
And here I am.
What I'd like you to do is state your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Tracy Mears. I live at, sorry, and wasn't
That's
even one
okay.
of my children. I live at 107 Ogden Street in New Haven, Connecticut.
Okay, and I know this is a new format for us and for you, and you will be presenting testimony on your behalf of why you want to be a member of the police commissions, and you will be talking to our members of our committee. And so they will probably ask you questions after you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you want to be on the committee, and then they will ask you questions after you speak.
Okay.
And, since you gave us your name and address, you can go ahead.
Okay. So I moved to New Haven in 2007 from Chicago. I used to teach at the University of Chicago Law School. I now teach at Yale Law School, and I have lived here on 107 Ogden since I moved, with the exception of 1 year. I rented a house in Hamden while I was looking for a place to live. I have, for basically my entire career as a law professor, been very interested in issues around policing. Most of my early work focused on strategies and approaches, the sociological theory of violence reduction in communities, in particular race class subjugated communities. That was my early work. And in fact, some of that work I did here in New Haven helped to launch Project Longevity from a research standpoint. You asked, well, let me say a little bit more about what I do, and then I can answer the question about serving as a commissioner, potentially. The work on violence reduction actually morphed into questions about how people understand their relationships with legal authorities, how they come to conclusions about whether legal authorities are fair. And that work led to a focus on policing, primarily because for many people, that is the legal authority with whom they have the most contact, actually, right? Most people actually are never prosecuted by the criminal legal system or spend time in jail or in prisons, but they do spend a lot of time with police. And so I have, for the last 15 years, focused a great deal of my research on policing. I had the honor of serving on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing that he convened after the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner over 5 years ago, and have been heavily involved in national police reform and transformation, both on the social science side and at the theoretical level, for the last 5 years. I was approached by Mayor Elicker to think about being a commissioner, and talked with him a lot about it. And I would say the primary reason why I want to do the work here at home is because, you know, my kids know about my work nationally. I tend to have spent a great deal of time in the biggest cities in the country, including the city where I used to live, in Chicago. But I think it's really important to model service at home. And I believe I have something to offer the city, especially in this moment, about how to move forward in policing. I've had the opportunity to work with folks in the city administration in the past. I think one of the folks who's going to be offering some testimony in support of my nomination is my dear friend and fellow worker, Kika Matos. We did some important work when I first moved here to New Haven to create the reentry office reentry that still exists today. That office was begun essentially out of a class that I taught at Yale Law School. I've done work with other police chiefs around training in New Haven, and done some work statewide. And so, you know, I feel I have something to offer the city, if the city is willing to take my offer.
Thank you. Alder Rodriguez, do you have any questions for Ms. Mears?
I do. I'm very pleased to meet you. And I just have a couple of questions. You know that the city is right now in a very sensitive situation, and you often hear we've been hearing two two particular phrases: defund policing and abolish police departments. Now, I
Yeah.
did review your resume, and I noticed that your resume is very rich in so many things, and that you've written a lot, and you've even done presentations, and now you're a professor. Is that correct? At the
Yes.
university. And you talk about police in terms of fighting crime, but you also bring about the aspect of the human aspect of policing. And so I just wanted to ask you, how do you see it? If you were a police commissioner in New Haven today, how would you help the city move forward in creating what you hear people are asking
Yeah.
based on your expertise and experience?
So I think when people use the phrase defund policing, they are, as you mentioned, referring to many things, but there's one basic thing that I think that they are referring to, and that is the fact that, you know, people look to police, or they have been given police to provide public safety. And that term public safety for many has been defined in a very cramped way, has only been defined in terms of keeping us safe from each other, without thinking about the fact that, of course, when people are looking for public safety, they also care a great deal about the excesses that those sent to them, the armed first responders, might produce in service of this idea of keeping them safe. And that's really the fundamental clash that you are hearing people talk about. And so, you know, when people say you should take these resources and focus on better housing, you know, better education, making sure I don't think this is as much of an issue in New Haven, but I think about other places where I've worked in Michigan, clean water, because we have to be able to wash our hands due to COVID. Those are all fundamental issues of public safety. Obviously, a police commissioner is not going to be, or the board is not going to be in charge of all of those things. But what the board can do is create an accountability structure for the policing agency that exists that ensures that the agency relationship is right. Now, what do I mean by that? If you are an agent, by definition, you have a principal, someone who tells you what it is that you ought to go about doing. And one of the things that I would hope to see is that the commission would, in collaboration with the voices that you've articulated, and obviously with the alders, make sure that the agency relationship is right. Make sure that, you know, that the chief of police here is carrying out the goals and projects that the community is articulating rather than the other way around. Because often I've worked with policing agencies that will say, we're trying to figure out how the community can help us do our jobs. And I was like, no. That's not the right relationship, actually, because if you're talking about how the community is helping you do your job, then suddenly you're the principal and the community is the agent. And that's not the proper relationship. And so, you know, my hope is in that an ideal world, that the board becomes the right kind of accountability structure.
Does that answer your question, Alder Rodriguez?
You're muted.
You're muted.
Yes, thank you very much. That does enlighten the discussion that we are hearing and we're having with our communities. And I believe you answered this in part. You indicated the reason why you would say yes if given the opportunity to this appointment. I understand that you have a very rich history in the field of policing and law. So you're indicating that the reason why you would say yes to this appointment is because you want to get involved in New Haven and also share with your children that you're getting involved at home.
Correct. I have been involved at home, let's speak, but being
Yes,
involved in a different way. Absolutely. Right. Because they're at an age now where, you know, there are actually things, you know, they can do. I was just on another panel just before this one from 5 to 6. And, you know, I was explaining about, you know, the kinds of work that I do on the everyday, while also trying to explain to my 15-year-old how she could demonstrate safely during COVID and, you know, engage in her own activism. She is goes to a school in Massachusetts, and she is head of the organization at her school. It's an all-girls school, women of color, and they're organizing a large letter writing campaign to 1,500 police chiefs across the country. So maybe Chief Reyes will get one of these letters. And so, you know, trying to figure out really constructive ways, you know, to help my children see that they are rising citizens. And this is all of our job to do this work right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Santana.
No problem. Is Alder Delphine on the phone? Alder
Yes.
Clyburn?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Chair. I have a question. My question is around integrity of the police commission. The policies and procedures that I'm sure it would you would have to look at those things to make sure that things are followed properly. Giving an example of, I'm sure you've heard of some things that have happened in our city. How would you handle an officer who have not handled himself appropriately when it comes down to the police commission? And my question is around the integrity of you, no matter how many people who sits on that board, not wanting to be upfront and willing to do things properly to help this city.
Alder Clybourne, your voice was really breaking up the entire time you asked the question. So I'm not exactly sure I heard the question. Let me reflect it back to you, and and you can tell me if I got it, but you were going in and out. What I think I heard you say was you were asking me about if there was a case or an incident that came before the police commission that had to do with a particular, an individual officer who engaged in, who broke policy? Is that the question?
Yeah, policy and procedure. How would you handle that, even though maybe your other members there may not see it the way you see it? How would you handle that?
Right. Well, if the evidence was that the member of the agency, the force, did not follow procedure, and I would just call it as I saw it. I don't know that it would matter to me that other people disagreed with me.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, that's good. No, I'm at, because from my stand and my point of view, we need people on our police commission that have integrity and, will make sure that the safety of our residents is number one, and that they are treated like human beings.
Absolutely. I can't imagine why, if the facts were clear, why anyone would change their mind simply because other people. I mean, obviously, I'm not in anyone else's head but my own. But if the facts are clear, then to my mind, the facts are clear, and it wouldn't matter to me. I guess if the question is, does it matter to me that people disagree with me? No, it does not. I'm not bothered by that.
Mm-hmm.
And what
Yeah.
and you're saying, the only concern I would have is potentially that whatever rules and procedures to which the officers are obligated to follow actually are not protective enough of the interests that you're pointing out that need to be protected. So I looked at the enabling legislation, actually, of the police commission. They're quite broad, which is why I offered the answer I did to Alder Rodriguez about really thinking about, accountability mechanisms. And so I think one important job of the police commission should be to ensure that the procedures and policies that members are obligated to follow to protect the citizens of New Haven are adequate enough. I haven't seen all of these policies and procedures, of course, because I'm not a commissioner, but I would certainly relish the opportunity to take a look, and I have pretty extensive expertise on what these policies and procedures should be.
Okay, thank you.
Did
Thank
that
you for the
answer all your questions, Alder Clyburn?
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Alder Hurd.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tracy, it's nice to meet you uh, through Zoom. I do have a few questions, if I may ask, and I understand you have a very extensive resume. You've done a lot of great work, a lot of great writings. Um, I am the alder of the Third Ward, which is one of the most impoverished communities in the city of New Haven. You know, we sit in the shadows of Yale School of Medicine, Yale New Haven Hospital, and we have a lot of issues in my community, dealing with homelessness, children, 30% of my community going to sleep without a meal, uh, affordable housing, unemployment. This put people in another mindset where they don't. Let me just put it this way. This is a little sensitive to me. There's a lot of hopelessness in my community. The Black and the brown people are suffering. They are on the street hustling to make ends meet, not because they want to, but that's the only way of means. I'm being a father of 5, a sibling of 12, the youngest male child in my family. I've watched my older brothers get brutalized by the police in the South, while my mother would stand at the front door in our front yard and say, please don't do that to my son. And it became a norm for us. I grew up thinking, oh, that's how it is. One, I would like to know, what is your experience dealing with these type of issues? I hear you're from Chicago, but then there's the south side of Chicago, and there are the north side of Chicago, the good and the bad. So I'm not sure where you are in that and what you've experienced, because that's going to be really a factor in my decision tonight. Not only that, you are a professor at Yale. As you know, Yale University are not quite the good neighbors that we ask them to be, or want them to be, or need them to be. What type of influence would that have on you in decisions on a commission such as the police commission in the city of New Haven, given the fact that Yale, the city, our residents are hollering and they are protesting the fund, the police, along with Yale, New Haven. Police is Yale, Yale Police Department, along with New Haven Police Department. So there is some underlining issues that's going on in our community. And your resume is impeccable. I applaud you being an African-American female who have obtained all of this. But where are we when it comes to core, real, nitty-gritty issues that I walk my community every day and see it every day? Just Saturday morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, a young man was killed in my ward. These are the issues I'm dealing with.
Yep. Okay.
Thank
So
you.
let me start with where I'm from. My family's from Selma, Alabama. My grandmother and my mother were civil rights activists. The clock you see over my shoulder was my grandfather's. He gave it to me 20 years ago. He died 20 years ago. His grandfather bought it. It was the first item he purchased when he was emancipated. When I grew up in downstate Illinois, actually, not in Chicago. I grew up in a town called Springfield,
Springfield.
Illinois, capital.
Mhm.
And my family was, my mother was a teacher. My father was a social worker, but our family, like many African-American families, were touched by the issues that you describe. Both in, I have had cousins who have been in prison. One of my cousin actually died in police custody. These are personal issues for me. When I lived in Chicago, I lived both on the south side and on the west side of Chicago. So if you know anything about Chicago, there's a thing called the Black Belt,
Yeah.
which is composed of the south side of Chicago and the west side of Chicago. My father grew up in basically a slum that is where Cabrini Green used to be. I actually have a picture of him on his front stoop of his house, and you can see Cabrini Green going up in the back. And it's actually a fascinating artifact because if you know anything about Chicago, you know that Cabrini Green doesn't exist anymore. It's been torn down and it is now a completely gentrified area. And a lot of the people who live there have been pushed west and south. So, that's a little bit about my family and my experience and why I decided to study the issues that I do when I went to law school is because of my family's experience. My father, the one who grew up in where Cabrini Green was a teacher who became a prosecutor. And so I was really interested in issues of criminal justice, and in particular, studying under my then mentor, William Julius Wilson, who's a sociologist. I'm older than I look. I'm 53. And when I was studying with Bill Wilson, that was when people tossed about this term called the underclass. And Chicago was experiencing well over 700, 800 homicides a year. So I became really interested in how to think about how communities address violence among their communities. That was the sociology before I became really interested in policing. I was a member, the church that I went to in Chicago, all the years I lived there, was a church called Saint Sabina, which is the largest African-American Catholic congregation in the country, I think. The pastor at the time, he's still the pastor, Michael Flager, is very good friends with Jeremiah Wright. And we would go out in the streets every Friday night and, march about how the city was addressing violence in the community. So I've tried to integrate my academic work with my work as a daughter and a mother and a cousin and a sister. All the things I'm interested in because of my family's example to me. And I've been able to use the gifts that I've been given to do this work. My grandmother always told me that my life was not my own, and that it was my job to use what I've been blessed with to help my family and my people. So that's what I've tried to do. That's the answer to the first part of your question, or at least an answer. You asked me something very specific about Yale. And I think what you're getting at, I think, is whether I have any kind of obligation to Yale that would keep me from criticizing Yale or advocating against what some might perceive as Yale's interest. Is that the question, Alder Hurt?
That is the question.
Okay. Well, I have tenure. They have to pay me no matter what. I have, criticized them on many occasions, including marching in the street with my friend Kika Matos about a lot of issues, such as, renaming Calhoun College. And I have argued to many people that I feel that Yale should offer much more support to the city of New Haven than it does. So, yeah, I don't have a problem criticizing institutions that, to my lights, should be criticized.
Thank you.
Alder Hurt, does that answer all your questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes.
Okay. Alder Saban.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, Professor Mears. I have a few questions. So first, you said that you read the Enabling Act for the Board of Police Commissioners, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what role you see the Board of Police Commissioners playing, especially given the protest recently and push for reform. What did you see in that Enabling Act that that caught your eye and made you feel like you could make a difference on that board in the city?
Yeah, I think the answer to that, Alder Sabin, is to say that I didn't see much in the Enabling Act, in the sense that if you read it, it's incredibly broad. There aren't very specific things that are required. It seems like there is actually quite broad discretion. So I would go back to the answer I offered to Alder Rodriguez, which is to say, to my mind, there is an opportunity for the commission to actually be an accountability body for the New Haven police. There are models for that kind of body across the country. Seattle offers one, Los Angeles offers another, that were specifically created to do that kind of work, to actually dictate to the policing agency the goals and projects that it ought to carry out and how to think about what the policies should be. I don't think, or my understanding of how the police commission has operated in the past has not been to do that. But the point was, if you look at the enabling legislation, there's no reason why you couldn't do that if you wanted to. So that's what actually made me excited about it. And I, talked to the mayor about the possibility and said, look, if I'm going to do this work, I want to actually do the work. I don't think it makes sense for a commission with the potentially as broad a remit as this one to be operating in the way that I've seen it operating in the past. So, I'm just potentially one person. I don't know what the other commissioners think about the possibility of that, but that would be the way I think it makes sense to proceed.
That makes sense. And in terms of your experience and what you know about the New Haven Police Department, what folks have been criticizing the New Haven Police Department about recently, and what you've seen in your work around the country, do you have ideas of specific reforms that you're interested in pursuing in New Haven?
I do. I do understand, though, that it's a difficult time to think about that, honestly, because reforms take resources. They just do. You can't, even if you change policies and procedures and, change, let's just say, go about the work of changing something like police use of force, which clearly needs review. If you do that, then the officers need to be trained. And that's not free. So There are many ideas about, I have lots of ideas about what can be done, but I'm also, I shouldn't say but, and I'm also conscious of the fact that it takes resources to do that. And that we are in a particular period of time because of COVID, where resources are scarce. I mean, you know, if you look at the police department right now, they had a force that could be a certain size. I remember when Mayor Elliker was inaugurated, and they had a bunch of unfulfilled slots. And then, you know, the mayor and the police chief decided together that they agreed upon a smaller force. That's by definition reducing the footprint, and people are talking about reducing it some more, probably as it should be. But we are in a world in which the city is and has been for a long time resource starved, and whatever we do, I say we as a citizen of New Haven, whatever we do going forward, that's a huge constraint and a real reality, I think, which brings back what Alder Hurt was saying about, you know, whatever Yale is or could be doing in terms of providing more resources, whether that's just money or in-kind resources.
That is definitely true. Do you think you could talk about a couple policies that you think you would like to see implemented in New Haven?
So one of the things, I think pointing to use of force is an obvious one. One of the things that I would love to see that I just, again, don't know about the capacity is real. It's hard to know exactly how to govern an institution if you don't have data about what members are doing on the street. So I, you know, I don't know, I'm not even sure if this is on my CV right now, but I'm on the monitoring team for the Baltimore Police Department. And one of the big problems that Baltimore had, and still has actually, in implementing the consent decree is the fact that the department doesn't have good data on what members are doing at any given time. I'm not just talking about reviews of particular uses of force. I'm talking about, you know, when you are out on the street, how many stops you do, how those stops are carried out, just the basics of what happens day in and day out. One thing I would really love to see is, you know, increasing the kind of capacity to collect that kind of data so that an entity like the commission could actually function as an auditing mechanism, which they can't do right now. So that's one. Another thing that I've actually talked to Chief Reyes about is trying to figure out how to improve and possibly reform dispatch, which I have now learned is not even technically a New Haven PD operation. I believe it's actually governed by a state entity, which makes things very complicated. But, you know, police go where they're dispatched. And so there needs to be an important reform of how that information is collected and how the, you know, particular resources, what we have now as an armed first responder, is sent to those, you know, to the incidents, many of which probably don't require an armed first responder. But it's hard to figure out how to fix that if you don't have dispatch reform. I don't know whether that would come under the purview of the New Haven Police Commission, but, you know, it's an important chink. So those are like three things just off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you could talk about what you would see, what you would view as an optimal use of force policy for a city like New Haven?
An optimal use of force policy. You know, I think there's some pretty standard use of force policies across the country. People tend to focus on banning certain kinds of activities, which is important, but more important than banning those, just banning activities outright, are making sure that there's appropriate documentation. Actually, any use of force policy must address documentation, has to have an appropriate articulation of a use of force continuum, and then importantly needs a mission and value statement that places preservation of life at the top, which if you're simply governing standards, you need a policy on which officers can be trained to constantly think about what they're doing in the moment, because often and that might have sounded in a way that I didn't want it to be. So what you don't want them to do is think about using force in the moment, but think about what they're doing in the moment such that you're constantly slowing it down, and actually avoiding incidents in the first place is the best way to approach a use of force policy. So the better policies actually look like that, as opposed to focusing on, you can't use this kind of technique, or you must not draw your gun unless. Those are the final details actually of a good use of force policy.
Mm-hmm. And going off of that, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the percentage of time in training or in the academy that officers spend on self-defense and weapons training versus de-escalation and crisis intervention. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see that balance, how you might like to change it.
I mean, so I've written a lot about this, about how to, my own view is that police training should be fundamentally changed, right? And so if you're oriented toward your job being when and how to carry out forcible arrest in the context of a violation, which is, how police are often trained, you will naturally focus a great deal of time on how to use weapons and whether laws are broken, rather than how to work with people to support their goals and projects, which is what I think actually policing should be about. So there's a quite wonderful model of police training in the UK that we have done some research on, that pretty much flips the script about how police should be trained. Right now, I've actually been in some conversation with the Connecticut Post, which is taking this moment to, fundamentally rethink, these kinds of requirements and the like. And that's going to be an important part of this conversation. But, another way of thinking about this is, what can we do now and what should it look like then? And I have, the UK model is what it should look like then, for the new officers coming down who may or be coming onto the force in the future. What we should do now, I think, is about specialization, having a lot more specialization and trying to figure out in the context of that specialization, whether it's necessary for sworn officers to carry guns all the time in those specialized contexts. My view, and I'm on record, it's the thing about being an academic, there's a lot of black and white out there, is that it's not necessary. But then you have to deal with the union contracts and negotiations to get there. That means that there's work for the state legislature to do. But finally, I'll say this in terms of what you all can do. Police cannot act unless they're legally authorized to do so, right? And so that means that there is an important job of legislatures, whether they are state or city councils, to articulate what is legally acceptable when officers are carrying out the law. So I mentioned Baltimore. We helped draft policy in Baltimore saying that for a whole set of offenses, Baltimore police are not allowed to use forcible arrests to carry out those offenses, jaywalking, loitering, so on, right? But it is actually possible for state legislatures and for city council when writing ordinances to say these can only be enforced by citation. That is entirely within your purview and power to do.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned violence reduction earlier and how important that is. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as potentially needing improvement in New Haven's violence reduction strategy and things like longevity.
So I have not for the last 3 or 4 years, I haven't paid very close attention to Project Longevity. I can say, Brent Peterkin is a good friend. That New Haven's version of it was the best implemented version of it. And one of the then students in my Justice Collaboratory did an evaluation, a statistical evaluation of the work. To my mind, what longevity shows is the value of using law enforcement sparingly, relying much more heavily on community organizations, and also paying attention to the data that shows that a very small number of people often are the folks producing a disproportionate amount of violence. And so rather than sending police in a blunderbuss fashion, stopping and frisking everyone, which is what happened in New York, it's better to use more targeted strategies. I'm not sure, I know Brent just left longevity. I'm not sure of the status. I had heard in the fall that it had gotten more funding, but I'm not sure whether that's still true in the post-COVID era. But it's an approach that is well worth supporting.
That's good to hear. And I have one last question, which is about 50% of New Haven cops are white men, and about 20% of the police officers in the city live in New Haven. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about police diversity and how diversity and connection to the community affects policing and trust.
So in New Haven, police officers aren't required to live in the city?
No, they're not.
Do they have to live in the city in order to apply for the job?
I don't think so. My understanding is that the state legislature passed a law a few decades ago banning residency requirements across the state for municipal police departments. But
residency requirements of any kind? Because that's interesting. I think about in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example, you don't have to live in the city once you become a police officer, but in order to apply to be a police officer, you have to live in the city. In Chicago, on the other hand, you don't have to live there to apply, but if you are a police officer in Chicago, you have to live in the city. There are different ways of thinking about, the value of residency. The best research on the issue suggests that officers with a stake in the community tend to do better, who actually get to know the people that they're working with. And there are lots of ways of creating that connection. You don't have to, it's not obvious to me, and the research doesn't support this, that residency requirements are the best way to do that. You can incentivize people to live in the community in certain ways. Yale does that, actually, by supporting housing benefits. I know in the past, New Haven used to have a program that theoretically should have worked well. I don't know how well it did work, where it offered officers incentives to actually live in public housing. But I heard that over time that program was abused in certain ways to offer, favorites of different police chiefs, sinecures and free spaces to live, which is obviously not the approach. But I think, the common thread in all of this is that it's important to figure out how to create personal stakes in the community, however you do that. And there are lots of different ways to do it. I don't think that residency requirements are the only way to do it. You asked me about diversity on the police force. I think it's important that police forces reflect on the communities that they serve. I think it's important not just to look at the members themselves. It's critical to actually look at leadership. So you take a police department like the New York Police Department, which is actually quite racially diverse. Majority of the members are people of color. But if you look at the leadership of the New York Police Department, it is practically all white and mostly male. And so I would say when I'm thinking about diversity in the New York and in the New Haven Police Department, I'd want to see it all the way down. My sense is, at least in the last few years, that, there are more women in leadership roles in the New Haven Police Department. And, many of the deputy chiefs have also been people of color, which is important. The final thing I'll say on diversity is, I think, racial diversity is key, race and ethnicity. But one of the most beneficial things one can do in terms of enhancing policing is ensuring that, or trying to attract more women to the force. It's an incredibly important thing to do. And the research there is pretty clear that while there has been an increase, like from the 60s to about the 80s, in women police officers, that it's since about the 90s, it's flattened off. And I think some of that is because, again, we were talking about unions resist the possibility of part-time work, which I find perplexing because, in a lot of ways, policing is a lot like emergency room nursing, which doesn't have a problem offering positions to part-time, to people working part-time. And you can imagine that working quite well for policing as well, where people would do a lot of work on the weekends. That would allow them to do, a full-time, part-time shift, and then be able to have more time to spend with their families during the week. That's a very gendered statement about who should stay home, but I'm just speaking to the reality of demographics. But again, that's often a union issue.
I actually have one other question, which is, there's been a lot of talk about the militarization of the police. And we've been seeing police departments rolling out things that look like tanks in some cities and towns around the country. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you think about militarization of police and equipment and stuff.
So here's the thing. Militarization is actually a quite fascinating topic. A lot of times people think about militarization in terms of, equipment that departments get from the military. So the 1033 program. It's important to understand that most departments don't get the big military grade equipment that you see from that program at all. Often what they get from that program are things like filing cabinets and the like. First of all, there's just like a mismatch in people's understanding about what that program does and whether and how departments get this military grade equipment. In other words, you could cancel the 1033 program tomorrow and agencies across the country would have the same level of military grade because they don't get it through that program. So, that's the first point to note. A second point to note is that the militarization analogy is interesting in the sense that if you really thought about it, you might say, well, why not go full military? And here's what I mean. I was speaking to my grandfather before, who was one of the first commissioned officers in the Army. He fought in World War II back when they were all when the units were segregated. The military trains people constantly. They are constantly training. They are very hierarchical, and it's very difficult to do anything without permission. Like when you think about shooting, like if we actually had a military model, a police officer would have to get a legal opinion before being allowed to shoot, right? So I find thinking about militarization, I'm being very academic right now, but you asked me the question, in a very interesting way. If we're just talking about equipment, there's policing agencies do not need the equipment to carry out the job that they are pretty much asked to do most of the time. It's not helpful in terms of enhancing their relationship with the communities that they serve, often harmful. We ought to be thinking about ways to limit it. The last thing I'll say, just going back to the beginning, but you should understand that you're not limiting it by just getting rid of the 1033 program. That's not going to help.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your thoughtful testimony, Professor Mears, and thank you for your patience, Madam Chair and colleagues.
No problem. I think we went over more than what we had intended on, but thank you. I guess my question to you is, Ms. Mears, you didn't talk too much about community policing. What is your feel on that? I mean, I know I believe in the community policing, but I also believe in policing where the police live in the neighborhoods in which they police. A long time ago, when I first went on the board, myself and another colleague voted to have the police officer live in the city, and it was overturned by the unions and what have you. Police officers have to live in the city, they have to live in the city in order to get points to be. They give you 3 points on your grade, I guess, if you pass. So it elevates you to a different level. But it doesn't deter them from leaving once they get the job. And that was one of the issues that I find is most disheartening, is that most of them don't live in the city and live elsewhere, and they really don't know the community in which they're working in. And that leads me to community policing. When I recall, we had a police officer who was very involved in the community. He lived in my ward. He was very involved. When my son was young, he would say, it's time to go home, boys, let's go. He knew what my kids were. He knew they weren't causing trouble. He just wanted them to make sure, it was like 10 o'clock, 11, just to get off the streets, guys, go home. And he said, if you don't, I'll get your mother. But that's okay, because he was interested in the well-being of our young people. They're not there now. And I think that's one of the issues that I find, is that the community policing isn't interacting with our community. And they have to do a better job at doing that. It's gone by the wayside, and community policing isn't what it used to be. I believe that police walking the beat is another way to get community policing more involved. And I know that's very costly, and we don't have enough officers to do that, is what I'm keep being told. So what are your feelings on that?
Well, so I think that when you say the term community policing, you have a very particular view of what it means to you. And I think that for many people, there isn't universal agreement about what it means. My view is, community policing is it's kind of a catch-all term, and that what I would have described what you said was just good policing, right? That there's no particular reason why any police officer, whether they lived in the neighborhood or not, could not carry out that job. I think that part of the reason why it's difficult to maintain it goes back to some of the conversation I was having with Alder Sabin about how police officers are trained. what the value system is, and the fact that in many agencies, there is just a lack of a theory about what it is you are supposed to be doing. So if you look at the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, one of the recommendations was that police officers should be guardians of their communities rather than warriors, right? And the idea that too many officers, you could imagine an officer walking the beat, Alder Ferraro Santana, and thinking of himself or herself as a warrior against crime. They're walking the beat, and in their mind, they would think, I'm doing community policing, but they wouldn't necessarily interact with your children in the way that you described, right? And so in your view, they wouldn't be doing community policing. So, I think it's really important for when police are carrying out this job, that they carry out policing in a way that's service oriented, that is, promotes a guardian mentality and not a warrior mentality, that they don't think that crime reduction is self-justifying, because it's not. And if you do all of those things, I would just say you're doing good policing. You might say it's community policing. I'm not sure what the officer would call who's doing that, what they're doing. But I would say, like, if they're doing that, they're doing the kind of policing that we want them to do.
Thank you. I would like to acknowledge that we have a few other colleagues that have also joined us in addition to Alder Furlow, Alder Antunes, and Alder Roth. We also have Alder DeCola, Alder Winter, Alder Festa, and our president of the board is President Walker Myers. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And Ms. Mears, I thank you very much. Are there any other questions that the committee would like to ask at this time before we move on to the next candidate? Okay, seeing none, we'll go on to our next candidate. Tracy, would you mind staying in case someone from the community would like, some colleagues would like to ask you a question after before we go into committee?
I'm gonna run down and get some dinner, if that's okay.
Okay, wonderful.
I didn't know how long this was gonna take. I can bring my
Okay.
dinner back upstairs, and I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh, can we have the next person on, Susan Lamar? If she's available? Hi, Susan, are you available?
I am.
Okay.
Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you now. Thank you.
Yep.
Could you state your name and address for the record, please?
Sure. My name is Susan Lamar. I live at 119 West Park Avenue in New Haven.
Susan, you're fading in and out. Is there a way you can get closer to the microphone?
Yeah, I was, I'll talk a little closer, but my face looks funny.
Okay.
My name is Susan Lamar. Is that better?
Yes, please.
I live at 119 West Park Avenue
Thank you.
in New Haven.
And your position is the appointment to the Board of Library Directors to fill a term for Alexander Supaso, but there's an amendment that needs to be made after we talk, but we'll talk about that after. tell us a little bit about yourself, why you want to belong to the board, why you want to have a position on the board of library directors.
Sure. I'm a CPA. I've been a practicing CPA for 30 years. I've lived in New Haven for 30 years, over 30 years. From the very beginning, I have volunteered my services into the low income and people who need a service of a CPA but cannot afford them, doing tax clinics, serving on nonprofit boards. Those services I've been doing through the Connecticut Society of CPAs and the Community Services Committee thereon. I currently serve on boards as treasurer and at Edgewood After School Program and the U.S. Grant Foundation in New Haven. I think it's very important for me to give back to the community and the services that I'm skilled in. When Claudia Mearson asked me about filling the position on the New Haven Free Public Library, I was honored. I believe my skills are a perfect fit, and I am a New Haven Register and a library fan.
Thank you, Susan. And I will go to Alder Clyburn. Do you have any questions for Susan Lamar?
Madam Chair, I don't have any questions for her.
Thank you.
Thank
Alder
you.
Do you have a question?
Madam Chair, thank you.
Yes.
I just want to say, Ms. Lamar, thank you very much for so many things that you've done in our community. And I have no questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Who else was here? Let me see. Alder Hurt, do you have any questions for this call for Susan Lamar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have any questions at this time.
Okay. Alder Sabin, do you have any questions of Susan Lamar?
I do not have any questions at this time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Well, Susan, you got off pretty lightly, and I think you didn't get grilled like the other potential candidate did, but we thank you for your interest in serving on the library board. It's a very unique board, and it does a lot of wonderful things for our libraries. And we hope that you will bring something that is not already with the library that will enable them to use your resources as a CPA. Thank you. Ms. Lamar, did I lose you?
Just for a second.
Okay. I don't think there was anything else I wanted to say. Normally, we don't ask other colleagues if they'd like to ask any questions, but I would like to ask some colleagues if they want to, that are not on the committee, that have any interest in speaking on behalf of Tracy Mears. Okay. Seeing none, is there anyone on the from the board that would like to speak on behalf of Susan Lamar? Seeing none, I will ask that we close the public portion and move on to, I'm sorry, we have to invite our attendees that want to speak on the item. I apologize for that. Is there anyone from the audience that would like to speak on any of the members that we for appointments this evening? Tracy Mears? Anyone from the public like to speak on Tracy Mears? Is anyone from the public would like to speak on the item for Tracy Mears? Okay, seeing none, going on to Susan Lamar. Is there anyone from the public would like to speak?
I'm sorry, Alder Rose. This is Kika Matos. I was unable to unmute myself.
Oh,
But
okay,
I would like to speak on behalf of Tracy Mears.
yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see so many friendly and familiar faces. My name is Kika Matos. I am a New Haven resident and I live in the Fairhaven neighborhood. Currently, I work at the Vera Institute of Justice as the director of the Center on Immigration and Justice. And it gives me great pleasure to testify in support of my friend and my colleague, Tracy Mears. I first met Tracy in 2007 when I was Community Services Administrator for the City of New Haven. She reached out because she wanted to volunteer her services to the city. At the time, I was working to start programs to respond to serious challenges that the city was facing, including youth violence, a lack of services supporting residents returning to our city after incarceration, and also tensions between youth and the police. Tracy and I talked through some of these issues and she offered to help. A few days later, I remember Lynn, my assistant, came with a package, and in the packet were 2 books that Tracy actually sent to me. One of them was Jeremy Travis's But They All Come Back, Facing the Challenges of Prisoner Reentry, and Joan Petersilia's When Prisoners Come Home, Parole and Prison Reentry. And Jeremy Travis's book in particular was instructive to our efforts. Tracy really was the expert who guided our efforts around reentry. She appointed graduate students from her criminal justice reform class, and these are specifically law students, to work with my office on reentry issues. One of her students, Deborah Marcuse, actually wrote a white paper for us, specifically focused on reentry in some ways that New Haven could stand up some initiatives. And this white paper ended up serving as the backbone for our programs. And when the city officially launched its reentry program, our first staffer was Ms. Marcuse, who became the reentry coordinator. And I know that her salary was covered by a Lyman Fellowship from Yale Law School. Tracy was also instrumental in helping us launch the Street Outreach Worker Program. She consulted with experts on best practices, and she assigned law students to look at model youth violence prevention practices around the country. She also provided support directly to the New Haven Family Alliance, which at the time ran the Street Outreach Worker Program. Tracy provided us with thought leadership related to policing and community, especially after the departure of Chief Francisco Ortiz and the appointment of a new police chief. Many of us felt at the time that under this new police chief, the police department was actually beginning to pretty drastically move away from its commitment to community policing. And so we sought out Tracy because of her scholarship on policing and because her scholarship is really rooted in principles of community respect and legitimacy. You've heard her earlier this evening, but I just want to reiterate that she really frames policing in this context, and she argues that it's only when the police treat community residents with respect and fairness that the community will recognize them as legitimate and work with them in partnership to reduce crime. Let me say a little bit about Tracy's reputation at the national level. She is a national expert on issues of policing. Vera Institute, where I work, is a leading national organization focused on reforming the criminal justice system and addressing specifically racism in prosecutors' offices, in police departments, in jails, and in prisons. Vera considers Tracy to be one of the foremost experts on policing. I also note that Tracy mentioned that she was one of the 11 members of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. So you don't even have to take what Vera says at face value. There's other additional organizational support for Tracy's leadership. And let me just editorialize and say we would probably be in a much better place today if the current White House had even bothered to read the recommendations that Tracy and her colleagues came up with. Let me conclude by saying something personal about Tracy. Tracy, I consider to be a dear friend of mine. And my own observation is that wherever she is an advocate for justice. During the fight for Corey Menifee and to change the name of Calhoun College, she was actually Yale faculty members to publicly speak out against the injustices that Corey faced and in support of renaming Calhoun College. As a Black Latina woman, I am proud to have as a friend the first Black woman in some 196 years to ever obtain tenure at Yale Law School. Despite this accomplishment, she is humble, she is level-headed, and as you just saw this evening, she is never, ever afraid to speak her mind. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kika. And I've known you a long time, so we go back, way back. But thank you for your splendid information about Ms. Mears. She really is a true treasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on behalf of Tracy Mears? Anyone in the public would like to talk about Tracy Mears? Raphael, did you want to talk?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Madam Chair, and the rest of the committee. Good evening, everyone. I did not know Tracy when she was the attorney with the United States Department of Justice Antitrust Division, nor when she was a professor at the Chicago Law School. I met Tracy Mears here when she joined the Yale Law School here in our New Haven community. I know her as a parent, a neighbor, and was proud when she was asked to join the Obama administration task force on the 21st century policing. It was great to say to people, hey, we know her, she lives in our neighborhood, she lives in our community. While a lot of the important work has been undone that was done by that task force, it is more evident that it's needed today. And it's great to have somebody local who's such an expert on all those initiatives. She's without a doubt one of our leading minds in criminal justice reform, procedural justice, the connection between deterrence and legitimacy in policing, and the role that race plays in interactions with police in our neighborhood. So I am here asking you to consider confirming her to the Police Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramos. Nice to see you. Anyone else from the public like to testify on behalf of Tracy Mears? Is there anyone from the public that would like to speak on behalf of Tracy Mears? Anyone from the public would like to speak on behalf of Tracy Mears? Seeing none, anyone like to speak on behalf of Susan Lamar? Anyone in the public would like to speak on behalf of Susan Lamar? Anyone in the public like to speak on behalf of Susan Lamar? Seeing none, I see that there are no other discussions on the table. I see a motion. Close the public portion is in order.
Wait, Alder.
Someone like to make that motion?
Alder Santana?
Yes.
I believe that Ms. Merson was here to support Ms. Lamar.
I'm sorry?
I believe that Claudia Merson was here to support.
Hear you. Okay, thank you. Claudia, would you like to speak on behalf of Tracy Mears or Susan Lamar? Claudia, are you there? Al, do we have her on the line?
She's in the room, trying to see if her audio, she have an issue with her audio?
Well, it's not on mute, so. No, she's not on video conference, so she must be on the phone, but it's not coming through that way.
No, she's not on the phone, but it's okay. We'll get her testimony for the record.
Okay. Claudia, can you give us your testimony for the record? Thank you. See no other further people wanting to speak on the item of Susan Lamar. I would like to make a motion to close the public portion.
Madam Chair, I second the motion.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion passes. Discussion. I would like to note for the record that there will have to be a change for item number 2, which is Susan Lamar. The order says that Susan Lamar to the Board of Library Directors to fill the term of Alexander Sipasso ending January 1st, 2021. It should be amended by substitution to replace the name of who she's replacing as Dr. Jules, who the term already expired. So would someone like to make a friendly amendment by substitution to that change? Alder Saban, Alder Clyburn, Alder Hurt.
I'll make the friendly.
Thank you.
I second the motion.
Okay, all in favor of changing the name of the library term of Alexander Sipasso to Dr. Jules?
Aye.
Thank you. None opposed? The motion carries. So the name on the amended by substitution will now say Dr. Jewell, and the term expiring should be 3 years from the date it's a new appointment. It is not replacing the old appointment. So it is a new appointment, and the term should be 3 years from the date that she received the letter. So it should be 2023. So I would also like to add that to the substitution as well. Someone like to second that, please.
Second.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the motion carries. So we've got item 1 and 2 for discussion. What is your considerations on the item?
Madam Chair?
Yes, Evelyn.
Yes, I'd like to make a motion that we vote these appointments out of committee for unanimous consent requested due to the summer session for them to go for, because it's going to be too late for them to go for a first and second reading.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Madam Chair, before you do that,
Yes.
you may want to consider discharging him for that purpose, because if you deny UC, then we're still at the scenario where we don't have enough time to vote them up or down.
Okay. So the motion, Alder Rodriguez, would you like to amend that motion to say discharge from committee?
Yes, Madam Chair, that we discharge
Someone
both
second
appointments.
Would someone second that?
Take them to the full board. Thank you.
Okay. All in favor of doing it as a, oh, I lost my train of thought. I apologize. As discharging it from committee? All in
Aye.
favor? Aye.
Aye.
No opposed?
Aye.
Okay, the motion carries. It will be discharged from committee. Discussion on the item. First, we'll take Tracy Mears. What are the colleagues' questions or concerns? Or you're all in favor? Now's your time to speak.
All in favor.
Okay,
All in
Madam
favor?
Chair.
Great candidate, Madam Chair.
Alder Hurt?
Yeah.
I am in favor.
Alder Rodriguez?
I believe that she's going to be a tremendous support in many ways, especially because we have very sensitive items like the Civilian Review Board that the Police Commission has a lot to do with. The Police Commission has a lot to do with many, many, many different things throughout the city. So I believe her expertise is going to be very significant, and I'm approving my personal is going to be to approve her appointment.
Okay, Alder Saban?
She has my full support.
Okay, so we can go to the vote then for Tracy Mears as a candidate for the commission.
You need to vote, Alder. Since you're discharging, no need to vote.
Oh, we don't need to vote? Okay, it's already been discharged. Any further discussion on Susan Lamar? Alder Saban? Alder Rodriguez?
Ms. Lamar has been tremendously influential in many of our services and resources, and I believe she would make a great contribution to our library in many
Okay.
different ways. So I'm excited about her appointment, and when it goes before the full board, I'm going to be moving to approve her appointment.
Thank you. Alder Hurt?
I am in favor, Madam Chair.
Okay, Alder Clyburn?
I'm in favor.
Thank you. See, is there any further discussion on any of these items? Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
I make the
make-
motion that we adjourn, Madam Chair.
Second.
Second. Okay, all in favor of adjournment?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, all in favor? The motion carries. Thank you everyone for your attendance this evening and all the other colleagues who joined us as well. Have a good evening.
Take
Thank you.
care.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.